Thank everybody for coming out. My name is Tom Dent. I'm the coordinator of Central New Mexico Move to Amend. I need all of you to sign our petition and go to movetoamend.org and become members. My telephone number is on the New Mexico webpage at movetoamend.org. I'd like to thank Bob Riley for helping us organize. He's a member of the church here, and I'd like to thank the First Universal Unitarian Church for hosting this event. Thank you. The bathrooms are over there, and Kaitlin should be talking for about 40 minutes. As many people that follow us know, we've tried to get our resolution to overturn Citizens United and amend the Constitution through the Albuquerque City Council. And that didn't happen the last time, we just barely missed it, but it is very important for people to get involved with local politics, especially with this very important election coming up in October, so we can change those things and get a resolution passed. And now I'd like to introduce the National Director of Move to Amend, Kaitlin Sopoci-Belknap. Kaitlin grew up in Santa Fe, and she's the executive director of Democracy Unlimited, which is one of the many coalitions that comprises National Move to Amend. And we'll be taking questions afterwards, and if you have questions, feel free to step up to that microphone here, and please take a brochure and sign the petition. Thank you.
So much. Let's give Tom and the Central New Mexico group a round of applause for a great turnout. And I also want to thank my mom for coming. Hi, Mom. And also Councilmember Ray Garduño, thank you for being here. I think it's really important to acknowledge our elected officials who are on our team. So I'm just going to talk about the background of Move to Amend and how we got into this mess that we're in now. Because a lot of folks think of this as starting with Citizens United. And there's no question that Citizens United was a terrible decision, but it also was an opportunity that brought a lot of people to the fore who we didn't know about before, who were outraged about big money in politics. And big money in politics is a key component of this, for sure, no question. But as I put up here our principles, what we actually start with is that artificial entities do not have constitutional rights. And you may have heard that described as being against corporate personhood or abolishing corporate personhood. The real kind of legally correct way to talk about it is constitutional rights. Corporations should not have constitutional rights. And our amendment would actually apply to unions and nonprofits as well, because our position is that only human beings should have constitutional rights. And it's pretty straightforward, right? It's pretty obvious. I imagine that anyone who's here tonight would agree with me on that. And you're in good company. You're in company with 80% of the American public who doesn't think that corporations should have the same rights as people. Yeah, we can clap for that. The trick is to bring them together and to actually organize a movement so that we can change the Constitution, and I'll talk about that in a bit. But I think it's worth taking a little bit of time to look at the history because I really like history, and it's because I think that if we understand how we got to where we are now, we can better understand how to take apart and dismantle the situation that we're in. So I did bring with me this timeline over here that when we're done, if you want to take a little bit of time to take a look at it, really is the history of how corporations got themselves into the Constitution and then expanded upon that. And one of the things that you'll notice when you look at it, it also has people's rights as well. So on the top is when corporations gain or lose rights, and on the bottom is when people gain or lose rights. And one of the things that strikes me is that when corporations gain rights, it's through Supreme Court decisions. So 5 people most of the time. They're not even, majority decisions. It's just a simple majority of 5 people are able to basically reinterpret our Constitution and grant rights to entities created by government. So let's start with that first, actually. Let's take 1 second. I know that we probably have a very well-educated crowd here, but if you'll indulge me for a moment on talking about the Constitution and what it means for corporations to have constitutional rights. So what's the supreme law of the land? The Constitution, right? So all law comes from the Constitution. I'm going to step away from this mic for 1 second, and I'll shout. So let's put it up here for a moment. So we've got the Constitution, and there's 2 entities in the Constitution, right? What's the first one? We the people, right. We all should know that. We the people. And what's on the other side of the line? and set to serve a certain purpose. So, for example, in Georgia, it was actually a penal colony run by a penal corporation. And so all of the folks from England who were in debtor's prison and couldn't afford to pay their bills, we used to have this thing called inherited debt. And what's inherited debt? Right, so your son will inherit your debt, and his son will inherit it, and his son, and his son. And why am I saying son? Because women didn't even have the ability to get debt. They couldn't own property. They weren't even human beings, right? They're just people. They have to follow the law, but they are not allowed to have any of the privileges or rights under the law. So inherited debt was a real curbing force on colonial expansion, right? Because you had this aristocracy who were not interested in taking their money and using it to go across the ocean and run into tremendous risks, ship lost at sea, pirates, disease, any number of things. They're far away. And so the English aristocracy wasn't so interested in helping the crown colonize this new land. And we remember here, of course, in New Mexico, that the Spanish and the Portuguese got here first, right? And they had a tremendous amount of money in their monarchs' treasuries. But England had just fought a war with France and really didn't have that much money. So England was at a disadvantage. And so England needed to use the aristocrats' money, the crown did, but they didn't really want to go and risk all their whole, not only just their fortune, right, but their son's fortune and on and on and on, and ruin the family name. So the king said, all right, well, the good news is I am sovereign. What does sovereign mean? You're the ultimate power, right? You are, in fact, the divine word here on earth. And so you can do whatever the heck you want. So the king says, well, let me create a new institution for you, aristocrats. We're going to call it the Crown Corporation, and it'll be a company that I will bring into being because I am your sovereign master, and you will be allowed to get away from this inherited debt idea. So as individuals, you might still be responsible for what you do, but when you join up with these crown corporations and become shareholders and invest your money, put up your money, then you will not have inherited debt. You will have limited liability. So you're only going to be liable for the initial amount that you put in. And what do I get out of it? Well, I'm the king and I did this for you, so I'm going to take some money off the top and we're going to fill the treasury of Britain and let's go, right? And so the original corporations in this country, and of course they weren't just doing it in this country, right? In India and in Africa, what do you think the Africa Trading Company traded in? Human beings. Let's say it as human beings, right? Because slaves, I think, somewhat dehumanizes it, and we think, oh, slaves. But actually, we're talking about human beings that this company, and most of them were chartered as monopolies. So they would have, full realm over all of the business of that type. And they also, though, had some obligations to the king, and it was spelled out in their charter. So it wasn't a partnership document. It was a one-way document, but there was a real benefit that came with it, which was this limited liability. So this country was colonized by these crown corporations, and they ruled on behalf of the king in the New World. And increasingly, folks started to get upset. Not all the folks were necessarily involved in that original revolution, but most all of them fought in it. And many people believed that they were fighting for the ideals of democracy that were spelled out in the Declaration of Independence. But unfortunately, that 5% basically organized a counter-revolution against that democratic spirit, and they gave us the Constitution, which, if we accept the premise that all people are people, I think actually is a pretty good document and a pretty good way to think about how we might have representative democracy. But what about corporations? So corporations were then, there was a lot of distrust about corporations. There was a lot of concern because a corporation is really just a tool for concentrating capital, for bringing together money, right? And so with concentration of capital comes concentration of power, and our founders or framers of the Constitution had a lot of distrust of that based on their experience that they had just had with these crown corporations. And so they did not write corporations into the Constitution. You cannot find the word corporation anywhere in the Constitution, which is worth noting because it's not like there weren't corporations at the time. It wasn't like airplanes that hadn't been invented yet, right? There were corporations, but they intentionally did not put them into the Constitution, and instead, corporations were chartered by state governments, which meant that there was a lot more ability to control them and to limit their behavior and put meaningful regulations. So does anyone know what kinds of regulations those early corporations in this country had? Sure. Yes, so they could only exist for a limited amount of time, like 5 years or 10 years. And then at that point, they'd have to come back to not just the Secretary of State or some department, but the actual full legislature to be allowed to continue to exist. Yeah, do you have another one? Yes, I thank you for bringing that one up. So any corporation that applied for a charter, a fundamental test that was checked of every single corporation, no matter what state they were in originally, was that they had to serve the public good. Imagine if that was the way that it is today. Imagine, it's like unfathomable, right? Yes, so back in the days of the crown corporations, there would be these things sometimes called quo warranto proceedings, which means by what authority? It's Latin. And that is when the king would actually revoke the charter of a corporation that had gotten beyond his control. And so we kept that same principle, and it used to be, and it actually technically is still part of the law, that that an attorney general or a secretary of state, depending on the state, can revoke the charter of a corporation, basically a corporate death penalty, if it does not serve the public good or somehow harms the public interest. Did you have one too, ma'am? No? Anybody else have some other limits were that corporations were not allowed to contribute to the political process? That was actually a felony. Imagine that. That was actually a felony in Wisconsin until 1953. So it's not like it's just, the days of yore. This is actually something that has been a struggle in an ongoing way in our history. Corporations also weren't allowed to make civic or charitable contributions because there was this understanding that they are economic entities. They belong in the economic realm, and they can serve a purpose there. They can be a tool. But if we're going to grant them powers there, like limited liability, and the individuals will not be held responsible for what it is that they do, then there have to become some restrictions, and we don't want them getting into the other realms, into the cultural realms, the social realms, the political realms of our society. Let's keep them as the economic entity that they are. Also, corporations couldn't do business outside of sometimes even the county where their shareholders all lived, and they all had to definitely had to all live in the state where they were doing business, and oftentimes it was actually the county, so to really make it really localized, right? And they all had a specific purpose, and when they filled their purpose, then they could either apply back to the legislature to say, can we keep going, and this is how we're going to keep serving the public good, or they would just be automatically disbanded. So the way that this works is, like, in Massachusetts, for example, I went to college there, the turnpikes it's all public roads, and you have to pay tolls and all of that. And that's actually left over from the infrastructure that was built by companies, and then they were allowed to make a profit. It was actually written into their charter, okay, you can make a 12% profit after 5 years, and then after that, the infrastructure that you built goes back to the public, and then the public will own it. And the reason why a corporation would even bother to do this is it was like a foolproof business model, right? You're building infrastructure for the public. And so there weren't very many corporations. It wasn't a very common way of doing business because it came with all these restrictions. If you wanted to kind of do the free enterprise thing, then you were going to be a partnership or, just an individual out, with your sign out in front of your shop and whatnot. But if you wanted to really pull together wealth and you wanted to have some of these privileges that corporations got, like limited liability and the ability to work with government to build this kind of infrastructure, then you would become a corporation, and you could make money, but not unlimited amounts. So the Civil War happens, and at the same time, we see the Industrial Revolution come to the United States. and also is one of those key movements where people start writing themselves into the Constitution. So who is the entity, who are the people who, through the Civil War, gain rights under the Constitution? Black men, right? Just men. Supreme Court's really clear, actually, in a Supreme Court case where they said, nope, 14th Amendment doesn't apply to you ladies. States that deny you the right to vote doesn't matter. This law, the 14th Amendment, was meant for black men, not you. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed out of the Civil War. And what's the 13th Amendment do? Outlaw slavery. And the 14th Amendment, I just said it, it guarantees equal protection and due process under the law and says that no state can deny any person equal protection or due process under the law. Then it's interpreted what a person is, right? So it's not women. Spoiler alert, soon it will be corporations. But what's the 15th Amendment do? It says the right to vote will not be abridged based on past servitude or color of skin, right? So these are fundamental changes to the law. And I want to pause for a second because, I took history class, and I'm sure you all did too, and we learn about this. But the idea that folks got together and had the gall to try and then successfully were able to change not just the idea that human beings could be slaves, right? Because that is fundamental. That's a paradigm shift, right? But the entire economic system of this country was premised and built around slavery. So it wasn't that they were just saying, hey, let's acknowledge these people. They were actually suggesting that the whole economic system needed to shift. And yes, the Industrial Revolution kind of helped fuel that along, right? Because factories became a more viable and then ultimately, I think, enticing way to organize labor. Because you don't actually have to own folks. You can send them home, and then they can have to deal with getting food themselves and all of that. But nonetheless, people who were abolitionists at a time when that was an entirely foreign concept, and the mainstream society, wouldn't just ridicule you, but literally would tar and feather folks. And the abolitionists they didn't just have a constitutional strategy, right? They weren't just about amending the Constitution, although I think it's very critical that we remember that was a fundamental victory that they were seeking. But they had a political strategy, so they built an entirely new party in order to move their agenda. What's the party that was built by the abolitionists? The Republican Party, right? Originally, the Republican Party was the party of abolition, and it started in states like Wisconsin, where folks organized in rooms much smaller than this, and they were in relatively few short years able to not only take Congress, but the presidency with Abraham Lincoln. And they did that because of their political strategy. They also had a direct action strategy with the Underground Railroad, where they were literally freeing people and undermining the whole system. And so in response, because the Underground Railroad was so effective, Congress actually passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that the states, even the states that were free states, were obligated to serve the slave states by anyone who they found in their midst who had been a slave. They would have to help aid these bounty hunters who were capturing people. And of course, we probably all know that they were catching people who hadn't ever been slaves, but folks who just had the wrong color skin and capturing them and taking them back to the South. And what I think is really exciting and interesting is that we're told the story that the South are the ones who were going to secede, and that is why we had the Civil War. And that's true, but not quite. There's a piece missing. So actually before that, in response to the Fugitive Slave Act, we actually had states like Wisconsin and Kansas that were in full-blown rebellion against the Fugitive Slave Act, and they had their elected officials at the local level, their governors, their justices in their courts refusing to obey the federal law. And so that was another form of direct action that went along with the Underground Railroad, where we actually had basically municipal or state civil disobedience, where states said, this law is unconstitutional regardless of how the Supreme Court wants to interpret it. And we are actually going to do what we want to do. And if you don't like it, potentially we will leave. And so Wisconsin was actually threatening secession well before the South was over this issue. And ultimately, they didn't have to secede because they took Congress and the presidency with the Republican Party. And so then the South saw the writing on the wall and said, all right, shoot, I guess we're the ones who have to go. So I think that we should look to past movements like the abolitionists and look at all of the strategies that they employed when we're thinking about how to powerfully exercise our current demands and be willing to not just do the individual civil disobedience like we think of, like the Underground Railroad, but actually collectively think about how our cities and our states, if the federal government ultimately is not going to go with us on this, then we have to up the ante and be willing to say, well, here in New Mexico, corporations don't have constitutional rights, and you can tell us that they do, Supreme Court, but how are you going to enforce that? Bring it on, right? We have to get to where we have enough power to exercise that, but that's where we need to get to go. So back to where corporations fit. So all of these restrictions originally had corporations on this side of the line, right? We went through. We talked about some of their duties to serve the public. Sure. No, actually, only applies to black men. But then, I'll stay over here. But then, so after the Civil War, we have this, really corporate heyday. The robber baron era, and even our sanitized textbooks, it's called the robber baron era. Tons of graft and corruption. And a real rise of power of the railroad corporations. The railroad corporations especially, but all large manufacturing companies too, start looking at this framework and they say, this sucks for us, right? We've got people agitating left and right. We've got, people organizing factory workers. We have the populist movement, which is the largest democratic movement in our country's history, on the rise, where folks are actually taking over and having state constitutional conventions and doing things like outlawing private banks in California and saying that, again, reiterating that corporations have to serve the public good. So this starts to look like, our 5% hold that we had on this law, on this foundational law, is in jeopardy now. So corporate lawyers concoct this idea that, well, since the 14th Amendment says persons, let's make the case that that means us, that we have rights under the Constitution. And they actually try repeatedly in a series of cases called the railroad tax cases in the late 1800s, and the court repeatedly says, no, 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 it wasn't meant for you either. But in 1886, they get their first little, camel's nose into the tent with a case called Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad. And I know that many of you know that actually that case was founded on other grounds, and it's debatable whether even the piece that got added to the headnotes that said corporations have the same rights as people, it even happened. Right? Tom Hartman, Unequal Protection, has a really great book where he spells out a very strong case for how that was actually conspiracy, and the court may never have said that, and it was the court reporter who added it in later. But nonetheless, whether done by conspiracy or just straight up fraud on the part of the court. It is precedent, and there was another case that came right after that is less known where they explicitly did rule. So unfortunately, we can't go back and say, hey, technicality, let's undo this. Because then corporations begin a long march a series of cases, it doesn't actually take them that long, to build up more and more rights under the Constitution. So I'm just going to run through some of them because, oftentimes people say, well, what does this really have to do with me? How does this impact us? And so I think it's worth noting the ways that corporations have overturned our laws and what it really does mean for corporations to have rights. So the next case is actually not a Supreme Court case, it's a Michigan Supreme Court case, Dodge v. Ford, but we talk about it because actually that is the place where the court, this Michigan Supreme Court, says, you know what, a corporation's purpose is not to serve the public good, a corporation's purpose is to maximize profit for shareholders. So shareholder primacy is established. And that is, if you go to law school today, that's what you will be told. Oh, well, what is the purpose of a corporation? Why do corporations exist? To maximize profit for shareholders. So that means that a CEO or other individual in a corporation can potentially be sued if they're taking action, personally sued, if they're taking actions in running the company that shareholders feel is not in their best interest in maximizing profit for them. And that's actually what Ford did. Ford wanted to pay his workers more so that they could buy the cars. So it wasn't like because he was some nice guy. He actually was kind of a shrewd businessman. But the Dodge brothers, who before they started their own car company were shareholders in Ford, they didn't like that decision, so they sued Ford and said, you are not fulfilling your obligation to us as shareholders. And the Michigan Supreme Court agreed. So then we have this case in 1922. Well, actually, before that, 1906, Hale v. Hinkle, that's when corporations are able to successfully get the Fourth Amendment right to protection against search and seizure. So now any environmental regulatory agency or OSHA, the Occupational Health and Worker Safety, or other regulatory agencies, or just local government or state government, if they believe that corporations are doing something wrong, they actually have to have a warrant to go onto their property, because corporations are able to make the argument that they're no longer public. So it used to be that their books were open to not just the legislators or the attorney general, but actually the public. And in Hale v. Hinkle, they make the case, no, we're private. And so we have the same rights as people under the Fourth Amendment. In Pennsylvania Coal versus Mahan in 1922, corporations sue the state of Pennsylvania because they passed a law. We all know here in New Mexico, right, mining rights are different than land property rights. So you can have rights to minerals and not necessarily own the property that those minerals are on. And so in Pennsylvania, coal companies were digging underneath people's houses to get the coal, and people's houses were collapsing. So Pennsylvania passed a law outlawing that, and the coal industry sued and said, well, if you're going to do that, then you owe us the right to those profits that we would have had you not passed this law. So they deem an environmental regulation a taking. And we have, what comes to mind, anything come to mind in terms of more current day, that idea? Fracking, yes. Or NAFTA, WTO, all of these trade agreements have that same principle. And so, of course, that puts a total chilling effect on local government, right? And, their lawyers tell them, well, you can't do this, you can't do that. You can't actually meaningfully protect your citizens because you will be sued and then you'll be responsible for all that profit. And we all know local government is basically bankrupt at this point. And so it goes on, right? Even if the elected officials don't want it to, there's really nothing they can do. Yes? The reasoning was just because you can't take, under the Fifth Amendment, you can't take someone's property without just compensation. And so the corporations, the coal industry made the argument, this is a violation of our Fifth Amendment. You took our mineral rights property without compensation, and so the compensation that we would accept would be if you pay us for the profits that we would have gotten otherwise. Does that make sense? Lois? Well, right, of course. Right, with all of these, it's not an accident that the Supreme Court at this time is made up of ex-railroad officials and lawyers for the railroad industry. Right, and that's what I meant about the heyday of graft and corruption. It wasn't just, that good people were swayed. It was that literally people were put in the Supreme Court who were going to side with industry. And the industry had a tremendous amount of money, much like we've got going on today. So Lois K. Leggett versus Lee is where Florida tried to pass a law taxing chain stores differently than local businesses and corporations. It was actually J.C. Penney sued and said that that violated their 14th Amendment right to equal protection. And so that's why we can't say, even though we know that Walmart causes tons and tons of different examples of harm and is not a good entity to have in our community, doesn't matter. We have to respect their equal protection. We can't discriminate between different kinds of corporations. And what's really, galling about all of this is at the same time, the court also basically relatively rules that separate but equal is constitutional, right? So we have the abolitionists fight and struggle for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and then the court with one swoop takes it away basically in effect and says, actually, Jim Crow is totally constitutional, and so now the only entity that the 14th Amendment really applies to is corporations. And screw all the rest of y'all. So just a couple more. So in the 70s, with the Powell Memo and kind of the response to the movements of the 60s, the Chamber of Commerce and large corporations, again, kind of get together and make plans for how they can take the next step and the next stage. And so they really start looking at the First Amendment and how can we get that First Amendment. So there's a series of cases that expand and give corporations First Amendment protection. So the first one is Buckley v. Vallejo in 1976. And that's when the Supreme Court says that spending money in political campaigns is equivalent to exercising your First Amendment right to free speech. And so that is why, even though we did have McCain-Feingold before Citizens United, we actually really didn't have meaningful campaign finance reform ever again at that point, because you can't limit, for example, if I'm going to run for office, you right now cannot limit the amount that I can put into my own political campaign. Because that would be a violation of my First Amendment right. And then it also gets expanded, of course, to corporations as well. So then you have individuals and their corporations able to make the case that any law that limits campaign spending is a violation of the First Amendment. And then in Vermont, they try to pass a labeling of bovine growth hormone. In 1996, they pass a law. And they're sued by the International Dairy Foods Association that says that you can't force us to label our milk because that's a violation of our First Amendment right not to speak. And so and the court agrees. And so actually you'll see that now farmers choose to label their that they don't have bovine growth hormone for their cows, right? But what's the little thing that's right underneath that? It says, right, there's no difference between the milk that comes from cows that had bovine growth hormone and regular cows, right? So what's interesting is the double standard, right? Whether you're talking about those families whose houses were collapsed, what about their property rights, right? Or the farmers who are trying to have dairy industry without bovine growth hormone, they are forced to put that label on, and goes back to what the gentleman said, follow the money, right? So the law is actually not applied equally, and this is something that goes, far back. It's not a current corruption issue. And I think it's really important because in this country we're taught that there's like this sacredness to the Supreme Court, right? That they are the ultimate arbitrators and they are, the scales of justice and they're blind and blah, blah, blah. Well, no, that isn't the case. They basically have oftentimes an agenda and they use very little rationale that makes sense to justify it, and they just go ahead. And folks like Rehnquist, the late Rehnquist, who, as we all know, is a real conservative member of the court, actually consistently in all these cases was a dissenter because he was a strict constructionalist, and he said, to the idea that corporations have freedom of mind, that was in that case, they actually said that corporations have freedom of mind and we can't force them to speak against themselves. Rehnquist Rehnquist said, that's ludicrous and doesn't make any sense. And in that one case, I would say Rehnquist is right. So there are other cases as well, but I'll culminate in Citizens United versus the FEC in 2010, really more based on that Buckley decision. And it makes sense, right? If money is speech and you can't limit the First Amendment, then really any campaign restrictions are a violation of the First Amendment. So independent expenditures are now completely legal, and corporations or unions or private individuals can spend unlimited amounts. So they basically gutted McCain-Feingold. And it's worth noting that in 2014, it'll come up for oral argument in just a couple weeks at the beginning of October, and then be decided sometime early 2014. We have a new case, McCutcheon versus the FEC. And in that case, as folks may know, probably doesn't apply to any of you in practice, but there are actually limits on the cumulative amount that an individual can contribute to federal campaigns. It's like $120,000 in any election cycle. $120,000 that any individual can contribute to any number of federal campaigns. And in McCutcheon versus the FEC, the argument is, well, you can't put any limit on us. So $120,000 is too much. It's not enough. We need to be able to contribute more, and it's very likely that the Supreme Court will side with McCutcheon, and we will see those limits, which are, I don't know about you, but I can't spend $120,000 for my congressperson or for president, but some people can, and they feel like that is a violation of their First Amendment. So what the theme that I hope you caught in going through all of this is every single one of these instances are actually local or state laws, or in the case of Citizens United, even a federal law that is overturned by the court when corporations argue that their rights are violated, right? So when corporations move over onto this side of the line, it basically negates the whole process, because what it means is that we cannot meaningfully regulate corporations. And any law that we may pass is at risk and in jeopardy of some company that has enough money to take us, the public, whether we're talking about our city, our state, our county, or our Congress, to go to court to make the case, and they find a very sympathetic Supreme Court most of the time. And so that is what we're up against. And so it's not just about Citizens United. And if we pass an amendment that only undoes Citizens United, we will be back to the politics of 2009, when corporations were in charge of our country and made the fundamental public policy decisions that affected our lives, influenced whether we went to war, influenced whether we were going to have genetically modified organisms in our food supply, what our energy sources would be, how our transportation is structured. All of that would still be on the table and working just fine without Citizens United. So what Citizens United represents to Move to Amend is just a galvanizing moment, right? It's the latest example, and it gives us an entree to tell this story, to make the whole situation make more sense to people of why it is that it feels like, I'm not the one pulling the strings and making the deciding decisions of my government. Who is doing that, and how did this happen? And like I said at the beginning, most people know that that corporations should not have the same rights as people. And most people, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Independents, agree overwhelmingly with us. So what that leaves us is needing to organize those folks. And so these are the principles. Artificial entities do not have constitutional rights, and money is not speech, of the Move to Amend, We the People Amendment that was introduced in Congress in February of this year. Our primary sponsor is Rick Nolan, who's from Duluth, Minnesota, and Mark Pocan, who's from Madison, Wisconsin. And then, though, you'll notice if you were to go and look up the We the People Amendment, or HJR 29, that we don't have a whole lot of co-sponsors. And it's because we're not actually putting resources at this time into lobbying Congress. And I am not here to ask you to get on the phone to your Congress members and lobby them, because that is not what Move to Amend's strategy is at this time for this amendment. Where we're coming from is that we need to build a movement. We need to look to the histories of the people who made that constitutional document, what it is that anything that we, think is worth salvaging in that Constitution. All of that comes from the amendments. I mean, even the first 10 amendments are amendments, right? The Bill of Rights. If you take all of that out of the Constitution, you're removing the people's struggles, and you're left with a document that's basically about protecting property, right? And we have revised it over the years to make it meaningful and to assert our rights. And I think we could go a little bit farther, but let's start with removing the entities that is corrupting our political process so that we can't move forward. And so we need to build a movement. It's not about a policy that is like the silver bullet to make it all happen. Newsflash, Congress isn't going to do this, right, unless we force them to do. And so, to do it. So that's what we need to build. We need to build a movement that is so powerful, that is so well organized, that they have no choice but to respond to us. And if they refuse, well, there's a provision in the Constitution for us to go around them and work with our state legislators. We haven't had a constitutional convention in this country since the founding constitutional convention, but it might be time, right, or at least to threaten it. So there is a mechanism, thank you. There is a mechanism to go around Congress, and some of the amendments that we have successfully gotten have come because states have started to threaten to do that, and then all of a sudden Congress finds the political will where it didn't exist before. So, we're not Pollyannish. We don't think that this is going to happen tomorrow, but we also don't think that this needs to take decades and decades and decades. I mean, I'm 34 years old. I just turned 34 a couple days ago. And we don't have decades and decades and decades of time. I'm not interested in doing this for my whole life while the whole planet burns down, right? The reason why we think that this is what needs to be done is because unless the American public gets our hands back on the wheel of our government, we're going to take the whole world down with us. And so we have an obligation to do this. We have an obligation to wrest corporations who are now wreaking havoc. I mean, they always have been, right? The colonial ones that I talked about. But in new ways that the world has never seen before, of this concentrated power and just flagrant abuse of human rights, of environmental rights and protections. And we are the ones who need to step forward and say, hey, either get on board with rectifying this situation or get out of the way, because we are going to do this. And so we need to engage not just in activism where we click on a petition and, post it on Facebook and feel like we've changed the world, right? We actually need to get together. We need to build relationships with each other. And the whole society is structured around us not doing that, because that's how we would actually come to recognize our power. So we need to exercise that powerful in meaningful and important ways, not just for the sake of doing it, but in strategic ways. And, I don't have all the answers for how to do that, but I do believe that collectively we do have those answers, and we can look to folks and we can say, well, it's different now. It's so hard. Yeah, but the women's suffrage movement was able to get women recognized without email, without text, right? So, yes, we do have it pretty bad, and it is pretty hard. And we are a disempowered body politic that is under the impression that we are the most powerful and right country in the world. And that is a powerful thing that we're up against. But at the same time, we have all the tools that we need to be able to build this movement. We just have to have the commitment and the integrity and the solidarity with other movements, because we see it happening everywhere, right? It's not just about money in politics or corporate power. Corporate power, the beauty of it is it connects to everything, whether you're talking about private prisons and protecting people from going to prison, or immigrant rights, or food safety, or localism in general, right? All of these things, every environmental thing relates to corporate power. And so this is just a way to tell the story and to get to the root of the problem. And it doesn't make, the beautiful world after we pass this amendment. And that's also part of why it's so important that we build this as a movement, right? Because we've seen examples of times when we've actually been able to amend the Constitution, but if we can't hold on to those victories and make sure that foundation, that new foundational law is actually a foundation upon which to build more human rights and more social justice, then we lose them. And that's not to denigrate the folks who, you know, they were hard fights, right? But it was a loss to have a civil war and a 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. And then because we still had white supremacy in this country, we were actually able to just get along with Jim Crow for decades, right? So we need to ensure that that doesn't happen to us. And the way to do that is to have a movement that's so powerful and so well organized and that recognizes the systemic nature of what it is that we're trying to address, that, you know, they can't pull the wool over our eyes. They can't divide and conquer us. And so Move to Amend has also made an explicit commitment to an anti-oppression framework. We actually, from our founding meeting, made a commitment to building a multiracial organization, and our national steering committee is multiracial, multi-ethnic, and that is one of the things that we really ask our local affiliates to also centralize a commitment to. And those tools don't just come naturally, right? We're intentionally divided from each other. I don't know if anyone saw this, but I saw this map recently where a graduate student had placed a dot of every single person in these large cities like New York and Detroit and Atlanta, and then they colored them by race. And it is amazing to look at, even New York, you think of, you know, a multiracial, multi-ethnic city, but not necessarily integrated, right? You see these pockets of here's the Asian folks, here's the black folks, here's the brown folks, here's the white folks. Detroit is like insane. It's just a line, you know, white, black. And increasingly more and more of our cities are going in that direction. And so, you know, that's a way to divide us that we can't let stand. Race has been used against us so frequently in this country that it's shameful and it's also ridiculous, and we need to get beyond it. So we need to get the tools, and I'm not speaking to an entirely white audience, but most of the time when I'm speaking to Move to Amend, I am. And I'd still say that there's probably a majority of white folks here. So it's, you know, it's up to white folks to actually learn those tools to build trust and to extend solidarity, to work across movements, and to show how, you know, at the end of the day for us, this is all about democracy. And what does democracy mean? The people rule. The people rule. The people have the power. And so, yes, corporations are the number one actor who is in the way of our power right now. But, you know, it's really individuals who are behind those corporations. And at the end of the day, what we're in it for is democracy and justice. Not for the We the People Amendment, not for money out of politics, not for, you know, Congress. It's for asserting our sovereign authority, I got rid of it, and actually making real the promise of American democracy that has never really happened in this country. So with that, I'll close, and maybe through the questions we can talk about how folks can get involved. But I feel like it's warm in here and folks are getting antsy, so. We also say, so I see that there's a question, and maybe we could take a few questions, and then we do have a special guest who I'd love to have him talk about his story and linking BP and what BP did in Iran as a real tangible example of corporate rule as it relates to international politics. So, yeah.
Thank you so very, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Thank you so much for your wonderful review of history. We all needed that review. I teach it myself when I was teaching. But my question is, are there national organizations throughout this country that are in coalition in this movement, and can you name a few of them?
Yes, so Move to Amend is a coalition, and we have been from the beginning. And some of the organizations that founded Move to Amend that are kind of the key actors in our coalition are the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Veterans for Peace, the Program on Corporations, Law and Democracy, the Alliance for Democracy. And then since our founding, there are other organizations that have come on and endorsed, like the Sierra Club, and not any national labor unions, but we are increasingly seeing interest from organized labor in getting involved with Move to Amend, because they recognize that even though Citizens United was supposedly for them too, it really didn't help them. And there also are a number of national organizations that are working on amendments, so like Public Citizen or Common Cause, Move On, It doesn't have an amendment campaign, and so actually there are a lot of local move-on groups that are part of Move to Amend. But the way that we're structured, yes, we are a national organization, but really the work happens at the local level. And from the very beginning, Move to Amend was structured. Our history, those of us working at the national level, we're community organizers, and so that's where we really think change happens. So I could have also put like local democracy on this list. And so a lot of the coalitions are also happening at the local level where people, have relationships with each other, and that's what we most encourage, and then from there it kind of comes up. So we don't have support yet from the League of Women Voters, for example, but in Missouri, there's a lot of really good work happening, and we hope that out of that will come a national endorsement ultimately. And so that's where a lot of it comes from. There's a mic over there if y'all want to just maybe make a quick line on the mic. That way everyone else can hear. I can hear you probably, but just to make sure that everyone else can hear too.
I just wondered if you, I don't think this is on. Is it? Oh, okay.
It's like the conch. It feels
Okay.
like it's on. Sure.
I just wondered if you and other folks are aware of the rights of nature movement in the United States. There is also a local movement of that. It has exactly the same issues. It has one is taken on corporate power on behalf of nature and communities. It has a whole foundation where lawyers will come in and help local communities who are trying to fight fracking or whatever. But that's a natural coalition. And I've been to a number of their conferences. They also have a democracy school, and they teach exactly the same thing you do. So that's something we have locally.
Yeah, and I think that especially at the local level, she's talking about the move to come at doing environmental protection through getting the rights of nature recognized under the law. And yes, you're right that the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund is sort of the leader of that, and we know them quite well. They go back well, basically started around the same time as Democracy Unlimited, the organization that I work for. Unfortunately, CELDEF, or the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, is not so keen on this idea of an amendment. So there was a representative at our founding meeting of Move to Amend, and I think she was more interested, but the folks at the top, not so much. And so we're happy to talk about their work and acknowledge how important it is and how we believe that there is a real connection there. In terms of being able to work together, they haven't been interested in that so far. So you're welcome to push on that. And also, I really think that at the local level, those kinds of connections can happen, and we don't need to worry so much about where the national position is. And Move to Amend is very interested in using this whole effort to really spark a conversation about, what would it look like if our Constitution was actually about affirmative rights? What if we had a right to health care? We wouldn't have the situation that we have right now, right? What if we had a right to clean air and clean water? What if rivers had a right to be healthy? So what if we had a right to housing? And these are things that do not have to be pie in the sky. There are other constitutions in this world that have actually that kind of language in them. And the UN Declaration on Human Rights also has a lot of that wonderful language in it. And we just are so attached to our Constitution and the idea that it's the best one that we are kind of stuck with it. But it doesn't need to be that way. And so hopefully this whole effort to amend the Constitution doesn't stop there, but really is about how do we assert our affirmative rights and codify those into the law.
A number of cities, in fact, I think even some states, have tried to pass anti-Citizens United legislation. Two questions. One is, what has been the result of those efforts? And second, what is the position of the National Move to Amend organization related to those?
So the question was that there are a number of states that have passed resolutions, and what is our position about that, and also an emphasis on that a lot of those only address Citizens United. So the resolution tactic is one that we actually really like. at Move to Amend. We think it's a great organizing tool to bring people together and assert our power, and also educate. And the way we see it right now, we're in the education and maybe mobilization phase of building a movement. And so any action that we take needs to be about doing that education and developing our organizing skills. And so a resolution is a great way to do that. We're not as keen about jumping up to the state level too fast, because in a lot of, probably a lot of you know, but New Mexico has passed a resolution against Citizens United. How many folks were involved in that effort? Okay, yes. So there are a few people in this room, and thank you for your work. But on the whole, that kind of happened by lobbying state legislators, and the majority of the public really didn't even know. So I would say that an opportunity was a little bit missed in being able to, really bring people in to the campaign through that tactic. That doesn't mean that, y'all go home and it's already been done. There's plenty more to do. And actually, what we're most interested in, if folks are going to work at the state level, we believe it needs to come from the bottom up. And we really need to build those deep connections first so that we have them when we get to the state level. But what we'd like to see happen at the state level, rather than resolutions, which are just a statement for or against something, they're non-binding, they're not legally any obligation to do anything, is actually to pass acts or laws through state legislatures that give Congress a timeline, and that actually say, you have 2 years, Congress, to pass the We the People Amendment and send it to the states for ratification. And if you fail to do so at the end of 2 years, we are voting right now that we will be the first or second or third or whatever state to call for a convention to pass the We the People Amendment. And so I'm happy to say in Minnesota, it hasn't passed yet, but that law passed through the state Senate earlier this year, and it was about to go through the assembly, but some of the Democrats who had pledged support started to get cold feet when they realized, oh my goodness, this was going to happen. I didn't know what I was signing up for. So the sponsor pulled it, and it'll be in the legislature again next year, which we think is okay because it gives more time. But that came out of